Good day. My name is Billy Bataille. Today, we will discuss the more complex case of inflation, possibly leading to an even worse problem, that of stagflation. We all know about recessions, which are defined as a period of persistent economic downturn when, as measured by the GDP, the economy decreases. We all know how recessions affect us because, well, those that lose their jobs do not have any earning and suffer as a result. We also know about inflation when prices increase, but generally do not assess as much importance to inflation because, well, a few additional percentages to be paid when purchasing goods, although it can, of course, have an adverse effect on our finances, well, we believe to be sustainable as, well, paying 3, 4, 5% more is acceptable. But inflation, if persistent and severe, around 7, 8, 9, or 10%, and for periods of a year or so, can morph into stagflation when we still have the inflation, but in addition, because of the disruption to the economy, it caused a recession at the very same time. When that happens, the solution is a lot more difficult to impose because the government, if they so choose to act, would have to increase taxes or decrease expenditure. And of course, you can imagine that this is not very politically palatable. And so very often the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Fed, has to step in and intervene so as to help the economy because they are, well, less guided by political considerations. What they will have to do will have the same adverse impact on the economy because essentially they'll have to increase interest rates so as to slow down the economy, which will possibly cause unemployment. But since this is the only remedy to the solution, the Federal Reserve Bank steps in and conducts their monetary policy. To review very quickly, fiscal policy occurs when the government, which is defined as the president, the House, well, it's the House of Representatives, and the Senate act. How can they act? Well, this would be how. They would, in this case, increase taxes or decrease government expenditure. And as we've explained, neither of the two would be a very attractive option for the government. And this is why the Federal Reserve Bank tries to step in and to conduct monetary policy. Now, how do you conduct monetary policy? Well, you can do it in multiple ways by changing the reserve requirement. You could do it by changing the discount rate, or you could do it through bonds. Essentially, what you would have to do would be to, well, increase the reserve requirement, increase the discount rate, or sell bonds. The point of all of this would be that through the money supply and demand graph, so we've learned that the money supply is this vertical curve. The money demand is this downward sloping curve. They intersect at a point where the interest rate is defined. And, well, if you do any of the actions described above, you would decrease the money supply. And if you did decrease that money supply, well, you would simply end here at a higher, let's say 8% interest rate, which of course becomes prohibitive, meaning that people can't borrow. And if people can't borrow, then of course they cannot buy. The entire point of this would thus be through people borrowing less, then we would end up exactly where we would have ended up with decreased spending. That's what would have occurred. If the government had acted, but essentially chose not to. So we often see monetary policy used in cases of inflation leading to stagflation for that reason. So why don't we try to draw the inflation and stagflation itself and see how we can go about resolving this issue.
So you have your long run aggregate supply, which is that vertical supply curve, which tells you about the full employment or the potential GDP. basically what we can produce under normal circumstances. Then you have your short run aggregate supply, which is just more like your demand supply. Basically, that's your short run supply that is not just our potential, so things can influence it. And then you have your demand. There's not a short or long run demand, there's only demand. And of course, the equilibrium is here. Now, what is a stagflation? Stagflation happens, and we have part of that now. The supply decreases. When the supply decreases, and you now get to SRAS2, it's called a stagflation. Why? Because if you think about it, right, let's take 21 trillion, which is our normal GDP, and let's assume prices, I'm not going to write a price, I'm just going to put the number 10, just, it doesn't mean anything, but let's say China. What you have when you have stagflation is you move from point A to point B, and what you notice when you move from point A to point B is that prices have gone up. I'm not going to write the dotted line because I don't want the graph to look confusing, but you can see, right? Prices went up and the GDP went down. So what does that mean? It means that this is a problem. Remember, we call that the recession because the economy is going down. But this is also a problem because you now have inflation. Hence, you say that the economy stagnates. You don't say recession, you say the economy stagnates, and that you have inflation. And hence the word stagflation. So we call it stagflation because there are two problems. The problem with inflation and the problem with the economy going down. So that's how you differentiate stagflation from a recession. In a recession, you would have moved from a point A to simply, right, you would have decreased the demand. That's what we did last time. And you get to a point B, which is like, I'm not going to draw it, but lower. So just imagine in your head, you shifted the demand, you decreased it, then it would have just been no price problem, just a GDP problem. So it would have been a recession, but this is a stagflation. Now, this is the issue when you have stagflation. When you have stagflation, you have two problems. And the rule is you cannot fix one problem without making the other one worse. You fix one problem, you make the other one worse. You fix the second problem, you make the first one worse. You have to pick your poisons, period. And so the situation, the analytical situation here is more complex because you have to consider a few things. So let's consider, we're going to try to do, follow more or less what we did last time. So you always have two options. Let's go with option one. Option one is to let the economy adjust. When you let the economy adjust, everybody knows that means that the supply shifts. So the economy adjusting means the supply shift. The supply could either increase or, of course, it could decrease. So Now, if you let the supply decrease, which is a shift to the left, you're going to go, okay, what's going to happen here? Prices are going to go up. Can everybody imagine the supply? Can everybody see the supply decreasing to the left, right? Prices are going to go up and the GDP is going to go further down. Does everybody see that? Well, that is not a good situation. So clearly, let's just not go for that one. That would not help anything. But you can increase the supply. And if you increased the supply, right, I'm drawing that squiggly line because you increase the supply, it's superimposed. So you're at that point, which is superimposed with the other one. This is S3, but S3 is really the same as S1. We're at point C, but really C same as A. So again, these two lines are superimposed. This is the only one that makes sense. And so you would say, well, I would increase the supply. And remember, right, an increase is a shift to the right. So that would be what happens if we go with method one and we let the economy adjust itself. We know that when the economy adjusts itself, it is always slow, but that's okay. We'll take that down a little bit later on. Then we, of course, have possibility 2. So A is so possibility 1 is the economy adjusts. So basically you do nothing. You just wait for the economy, right? Possibility 2 is you actually do something. Okay, so 1 is you do nothing. B is you do something. I'm not going to write it all. When you do something, it's the demand curve that shifts. Of course, the demand could go up or the demand could go down. We know this, and so you're at point B. Would you want to decrease the demand or would you want to increase the demand? So does anybody have a quick answer to that one? You're at point B, you want to help with stagflation. Would you want to increase the demand normally or decrease the demand?
Increase.
Right? So increase the demand. So this would be an increase in the demand. You go from D1 to D2. And this is fine, guys, because we are now at point C prime. And at point C prime, what you have is you're back at that long run aggregate supply, that magnet. Oh, wow, that's great because I know we have to be at the long run aggregate supply. We are fine. So why don't we take it all down in a table? We started at point A. We moved to point B. We want to look at a few criteria. We want to know what happens to the price, what happens to the quantity, which here is the GDP. And we'll still consider how long it takes. So when you go from point A to point B, what happens to price? Does price go up or down?
Up.
When you go from point A to point B, what happens to quantity or the GDP? Does it go up or down?
Down.
And these are the two problems that we have, hence stagflation. Then we said, okay, let's try to do nothing, literally nothing. You wait for the economy to adjust, literally do nothing. Then you get to point C. What we need to know is from point A to point C, what happened to price? So when you went from point A to point C, what happened?
Increase.
From point A to point C. C being the same point as point A, stayed the same.
Oh, C. Okay. I thought you meant C prime.
Exactly. So, and what happened? Well, maybe you can answer this one. Then what happened to the quantity when you went from A to C?
It returned to the full employment.
Exactly. It stayed the same also. So that's what it does. You're going to go and do all that effort. Well, we didn't do it on purpose. The supply decreased on us. What happened is COVID-19, and we get half of our stuff from China, and China stopped producing. So they couldn't send us the dollar store things. They couldn't send us the pharmaceutical equipment, the masks, because they produce the masks. They couldn't even send us the parts that we need to put in the car so we can sell a car. So the supply decreased. I know you're going to talk about the demand. We did that last week when we did recession. But that part, which is the decrease in the supply, can happen. And usually you don't choose it. It happens. But we studied it and we go, well, we could do nothing. Let the economy adjust. That is one. And when you do that, then you can go back to where you were. But, you know, that took some time. It's not fast. The economy takes time to adjust. Remember, you are sick. You could, you have a sprained ankle. You could stay at home. Just, rest it. Yeah, you're going to have to go to work. So I guess you're going to drive. You're not going to try to put too much effort. Eventually, it's going to get better. Or you go to the doctor, or at least to the drugstore. You get some types of bandage that you put on it. You maybe take a day off from work so that you don't walk on it for a day. You put that bandage, then it's better. You could do something. Do something is solution two. If you do something, you go from point A, you actually end up at point C prime. So let's see if point C prime is better or worse than point C. When you are at point C prime, so from A to C prime, what happened to the quantity? Did the quantity go up or down from A to C prime?
It's the same.
It's the same. Good. Now, most people are like, well, isn't that fantastic? We had an unemployment problem or we were in a recession. We are out of it. We are back to our full employment, natural rate of output. This is fantastic. Yeah, but you haven't considered all the variables here. What about price? When you go from A to C prime, what happens to price?
It increases.
It increases. I'm actually going to draw, basically it increased from A to B, and it increases from B to C price. It increased a lot. You can see how high price is. You know what? I actually even need to write something else here, like 14. It's even worse. So I have a problem here. See, if you compare C to C prime, doing nothing, which is 1, let the economy adjust, to doing something, which is 2, doing something, they both give you the same result as far as the quantity, meaning that they have resolved your production problem. But C prime makes it that prices are much higher. So I don't know that. Why would C prime be better? I don't see how C prime is better. It's the same for quantity, but it's worse for price. But we know C prime is faster. So then, as far as quantity is concerned, both solutions are equal. As far as price is concerned, C is better than C prime. And as far as time is concerned, C prime is better than C. And this is where you have to look at the other factors to make a decision. So if you were like really working for the government and they told you, well, which one do we pick? C or C prime? Then you have to look at many other factors. You have to look at, whether it's a democratic, the Democrats are in power, whether the Republicans are in power. You have to, one of them is going to prefer, for example, if you do something, if you say, I'm going to do C prime, remember, it's increasing expenditure or cutting taxes. Well, the Democrats are going to increase expenditure. The Republicans are going to decrease taxes. You look at other factors. You go, okay, do we have already a high inflation? Because if we already have inflation, then I'm not going to choose C prime, because C prime actually makes it that the high inflation that we already have is going to be even higher. So no. But hey, right now, we don't seem to have inflation. Prices are low. So maybe you choose C prime. Hold on, they're closing up the meat producing factories or plants in the United States because they have problems. So you're going to have increases in the prices of pork. Is that going to be inflation? Well, just for meat, so it's going to be okay. Oh, the price of oil has gone down, so not going to be inflation because transportation costs are cheap. Okay, so maybe I choose C prime. You have to consider other factors. Do you have a large debt? If you have a large debt, then increasing expenditure or decreasing taxes, that's not a good option because both of them are going to increase the debt. So, well, I don't know. Then I can't afford to do something. Then I just let the economy adjust automatically by doing nothing. All of those are factors. Hey, forget about prices. Is the recession really, 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 really bad? Or is it just a mild recession? And I'm just going to call it, severe recession, but it means severe or not. If a lot of people are out of a job, like now, well, I don't think you can afford time. I think you have to act right now. So then you have to pick C prime, even if it increases prices, because there are 30 million people out of a job. How long do you think that can last and be healthy? All of those are the factors that you have to consider. And maybe I should have written it on the top, but those are all of the factors that you consider. There are more, but I'm just writing a few of them here. And that's what's going to determine. So I can't actually tell you whether you want C prime or C. There's not one that is obviously better. So if there's a question that's being asked to you, then the question will have to specify, oh, and we are in a very severe recession. So which one do you choose? And then you would say C prime, right? Maybe I can write a few solutions. So if the recession is severe, you pick C prime because you want to solve the problem fast, right? I'm going to put C prime is fast. If you have a lot of debt, then you pick C, because C is cheap, right? Because C prime involves, expenditure or decreased taxes. Both of them will cost the government. So I'm not writing everything. Obviously, if there's a high inflation, you cannot afford, right, to increase more. So you would choose C because the price is better. Okay, so these are some of what you will have to consider in real life or in an exam question. But I'm going to tell you something, guys. I am not happy with either of the two solutions. It seems that, honestly, there must be a third way. The problem is, I mean, we've tried decreasing supply further. That doesn't mean to make any sense, right? Draw a supply to the left, and it worsened both problems, actually. So I don't see how that's good. So that's not a good solution. But we also tried decreasing the demand. And why would we decrease the demand? We have two problems. Decreasing the demand makes, I mean, how that for sure is going to make the GDP lower. Huh, you're right. Decreasing the demand does make the GDP lower. And that seems to be, why would I do that? But why don't I just draw it and see where it leads us? And I think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to redraw another curve, okay? And I'm redrawing another curve just so it's because otherwise it's going to be too hard to look at one curve and compare both. So obviously I don't need to explain everything. We have the long run aggregate supply. We have the short run aggregate supply. One. I'm still trying to be thorough because I want you to be able to, you know, understand what's happening. We have the demand, which is neither, well, it's both short run and long run, however you want to call it. We draw our problem, which was a decrease in the supply, and we explained it by, for example, in this case, right, China not being able to produce a lot of the intermediate goods, which means that we're vulnerable to their problems. So that is this. And we wrote that that meant that we went from point A to point B. So we're basically, you know, I'm not going to necessarily write all the numbers. We kind of know what the problem is. Prices went up because you're now at point B and you were at point A, and quantity went down. So we have two problems and we're trying to fix both problems. And we're now trying to explore another possibility. Honestly, I'm not going to say it's too promising, but kind of desperate. So let's say that we decrease the demand. So we use solution 2 and we do something. I'm going to actually put number 2 there, right? Because 2 is, right? That would be a decrease in the demand. I can actually, why don't I just put it there? Right? And for this, I'm going to put 1 because this was solution 1, right? And this ended up being the one we wanted. So I'm just going to put the number 1 there. So now, if we are at point, if we decrease the demand, where are we? I think we're here, right? Yeah, that's where we are. That's, let's call this C prime prime. Okay, what's bad with C prime prime? Why do I not like C prime prime? What did C prime prime accomplish that actually made our problem worse?
The GDP is below potential, so decreased quantity.
Oh, bad. Horrible. Okay, I made my problem worse. I told you this was not promising. This is kind of stupid. But what's the good thing about C prime prime? prices went down from B to C prime prime. Actually, they're like kind of back all the way to what they were when you were at A. Well, maybe I can work with this. This might not be as bad as I think it is, since I worsened a problem, but then I made another problem worse. Actually, if you go back to the first graph on your top left-hand side, let's call that graph A. We're going to call it A, and we're going to call that graph B. Well, actually, I shouldn't have done that, but that's okay. A and B. If you go to graph A, right, you went to C prime as a solution, and we said, yeah, why don't we consider C prime as a solution? Because sometimes it's better. Look, when there's a severe recession, I choose C prime, but it still made a problem worse because it increased prices. So why are we so prejudiced about C prime prime, which does make a problem worse? It just happens that it makes the GDP worse, but it does solve your other problem. We shouldn't be. Most people always assume that a decrease in the GDP or an increase in unemployment is the worst thing that can happen to the economy. And that is true most of the time. But sometimes that is not what happens. Sometimes the inflation is actually the problem. I think in this class we discussed the hyperinflation. Remember in Germany between the wars, or in Zimbabwe? And the truth is, when there was an oil shock in the United States in the 1970s, it created inflation in the 1980s in the United States. So at that time, President Reagan made the choice to say, you know what? I know everybody's always focusing on unemployment, and our unemployment rates are not good because of this oil shock, and that's not good. But you know what's worse? Inflation. Inflation is so high that it's going to destroy the economy even more. And then when prices are so high, it doesn't even matter. You're not going to be able to afford things anyways. And so we said, you know what? The biggest problem to fix is inflation, not unemployment. And then he tried to fix it. And he said, I will make unemployment worse, but at least I will fix the inflation problem. And it actually turned out to be the good solution because the inflation was so high that people couldn't borrow, businesses couldn't borrow. So the businesses were, well, it's good that I could maybe hire people, but I don't have that new piece of machinery. Hence, I don't need to hire you anyways. You know what? This is not over. C prime has another. Can anybody figure out the other problem of being at C prime beside? Okay, I get it. Prices go down, good. GDP goes down, bad. What is the other problem with being at C prime? I mean, how long can I actually stay at C prime? You know what? I actually don't think I can stay at C prime because the long run aggregate supply is a magnet and you must go back to it. It is the only stable equilibrium point. So you cannot be at C prime. So, okay. So what will happen now? Let's say I did decrease the demand and I did end up at C prime. What would then happen? Or what must happen? We must go back to the long run aggregate supply. So maybe I'll just write that. That's like a golden rule. Must return to long run aggregate supply.
Are you talking from C prime prime
Oh, could
or
you repeat what you said?
C prime? Yeah, are you
No,
talking
we're at C
about,
prime
are we
prime.
talking about from C? Okay, okay.
Because if you go at graph A at the top left, C prime is at the long run aggregate supply, and C also. So there's no problem with the top left-handed graph. You're both back there. Ultimately, you're fine. But for the graph that I call graph B,
Yeah.
which is really at the center of your screen, You are at C prime prime now because you chose to do something bold and decrease the demand because you say, I have to fight inflation. The problem is, this is not a stable equilibrium. Oh, I have a question. What happens when you do nothing? You're at C prime prime. You already did your bit. You did what you wanted. Now you do nothing. What will happen?
You're talking about returning to the long run aggregate supply?
Yes. And because you're doing nothing, the way you will return to that long run aggregate supply is by, well, you're doing nothing, right? You're just waiting, right? So the economy will self-adjust, and it will self-adjust by shifting all the way back to that long run aggregate supply, and it will be a point that you will call D. It makes perfect sense. It has to, because we know that when you do nothing, the supply shifts, and the supply automatically shifts, obviously the correct way, and it goes all the way back to D. Why don't I just map all of this out? Because I kept thinking I had to choose between C and C prime. Doesn't seem to be that, because I came up with another solution. D. Okay, so let's say that I am trying to do the same analysis. When you go from A to D, what happened to prices when you go from A to D?
They decrease.
That's interesting. What happened to quantity when you go from A to D?
It's the same.
Okay, well, okay. We said I don't want to go to C prime prime because you're going to make my GDP worse and you're going to make unemployment worse and it's all going to collapse. Actually, just wait for it. Eventually, you go to D because the economy adjusts and you're still at that same level. So all of those are basically equal. So none of them is better than the other based on quantity. We know that when you go to C prime, the price goes up. How is that good? We know when you go to C, it's the same. And when you go to D prime, prices are even lower. I think D seems to be, it's the same quantity and it's a lower price than the other solutions. So D seems to be the absolute best. What's actually a flaw with D? Because otherwise, why wouldn't I just do D? So what is a flaw with D? How long did it actually take us to get to D? Okay, hold on. So for all of them, you go from A to B. So there's that issue. Well, that takes the same time for all of them. Then you have to go from B to C prime. Oh, that's kind of, that takes a certain amount of time. So I'm just going to, it happened kind of fast because, right, when you shift the demand, you decide, you make it fast. But then you had to go all the way to D. Do you see that big all the way from C prime to D? It's clearly the biggest shift that we've seen. So it's extremely slow. And that's why D's problem is with the time frame. D part of it going from B to C prime happens fast, but then going from C prime prime, but then going from C prime prime to D, it happens super slow. So if you want it again, you have to look at all of these factors to decide, do you want C? Do you want C prime? Do you want D? Which is better? Well, if you are in the 1980s and you're suffering from stagflation, which all of this is stagflation, you have two problems. The GDP goes down, inflation goes up. If you are in the 1980s and you go, yes, I know I have stagflation, but my biggest problem is that we have inflation, then you definitely say, I don't care about the cost. I have to fix inflation fast. Well, you know, the fastest way to solve inflation is actually to go from B to C prime prime. Because when you did something, which is you shifted the demand, that happened really fast and it decreased the price fast. So do it. And bonus is you're going to end up at D eventually, and prices are going to be even better. So when you have an inflation, remember I just wrote C is better. Forget about C. D is great when you have a high inflation, because D solves your inflation problem fast. By going from B to C prime, you solve your problem fast, because shifting the demand is always faster than waiting for the economy to adjust. And so when you go from B to C prime prime, you are really solving your inflation problem fast. And then you get a bonus, which is it goes even lower. If your problem is that you have a severe recession, C prime, not C prime prime, C prime is still your best option, because you go from B to C prime, that's on the top left-hand graph. Remember, anytime you shift the demand, it happens fast. So you solved your recession problem super fast. So that's what you want to do. Sometimes you go, well, the recession is not that bad. I know I'm at point D. The recession is not that bad. So why don't we just wait and we'll let the economy adjust all the way to C, and that way we'll be back. The economy will be good. Prices will be back down. So it depends on the solution. Sometimes C prime is the best solution. Sometimes C is the best solution. Sometimes D is the best solution. Of course, to do D, you have to go through C prime prime, right? So it's never D really. It's D and C prime prime together that are, you know, the two. So I'm going to just put it there. D plus C prime prime. And that is how things would work. D plus C prime prime would be, you cannot go to D without going to C prime prime. So this, now maybe you understand how this is a little bit more, I mean, that's why I didn't do that last time. Last time we did recession. This time we're doing stagflation. Stagflation is obviously worse than deflation. Again, you could solve it in two ways. If you do nothing, the economy adjusts on itself. So there's nothing that happens. But I will still just, this time, if you do something, if you shift the demand, remember. So there's two ways to do it. So basically, there's 2A, and I'm putting it in a different color, and 2B. 2A is the government or fiscal policy, right? Fiscal policy, when the government does something. You can always increase expenditure or not, or increase taxes or not. Obviously, you increase expenditure when you want to increase demand. So that would be, right, like, I'm going to write it there, but C prime, right? That's what you did. You increased the expenditure. Decreased the expenditure, you get to C prime prime. Or you could obviously play with the taxes. And if you do that, you can increase or decrease taxes. Maybe I can write that very quickly for you. But if you increase or decrease taxes, what happens is you simply remember this GDP equation. And this GDP equation, right, is C plus I plus G plus NX. And we know that if you decrease taxes, people go, oh, I can spend more. And if you increase taxes, people go, oh, I can't spend as much. So that's what you could do. So it's the same thing, right? If you increase taxes, that's really C prime prime. And if you decrease taxes, that's C. The other completely different avenue is to go with the Fed, which is monetary policy. And the Fed has 3 tools, not 2, 3 tools. The Fed can decide to change the reserve requirement. The Fed can decide to change the discount rate. The reserve requirement, that is how much banks have to keep in their safe in case you want to withdraw your money. The discount rate is the rate at which the banks borrow from the Fed. Or the Fed could decide to do open market operation. I'll just put market. If you obviously do the reserve requirement, you can increase or decrease. If you do the discount rate, same thing. You can increase or you can decrease. And if you do the market, you can either sell or buy. And well, we did all of that, so we don't need to do all of that. But we know that whatever you do for all of those, it's going to either increase or decrease the money supply. And if you increase or decrease the money supply, you are going to then change the interest rate in the economy. I'll put it as R. The interest rates will either increase or decrease. And you know what's going to happen if you increase or decrease the interest rates. You will borrow more or you will buy more, right? And that will still lead to changing the supply or changing the demand. Either way, it's you do fiscal policy, it's direct. You do monetary policy, it's indirect. But you get to the same solution. And so that's what you guys have to look at when we're trying to figure out how the economy works and what you can do, what you shouldn't do. You obviously have to look at whether it's a recession or whether it's stagflation. You draw it on the graph. You get from point A to point B, and then point B will tell you it's a recession or it's stagflation, one problem or two problems. Then you go, well, what are my solutions? Your solutions are always twofold. One or two, you do nothing and the economy adjusts. You do something and then you do something yourself. If you let the economy adjust, the supply will shift back to the long run aggregate supply, wherever it is. That's all it can do. If you do something, the demand will shift the way you want it to shift. You could increase the demand or decrease the demand using fiscal or monetary policy. We just explained that. And you get to a point, you can see here in this particular case, if you could actually decide to go either way from point B. In graph A, you get to point C prime and you're like, I'm done, because you already are at the long run aggregate supply. And that was also what you could do last time. But this time you have another opportunity. You could say, why don't I because I have two problems, try to fix the other problem quickly by decreasing the demand, because we know whenever you do something, it happens fast. You're taking your medication, right? You're going to be healed fast. Of course, there's a cost.
And that cost is, well, one of two. If you chose to combat inflation and to decrease the demand, the cost is in the form of increased unemployment. It is once again unavoidable, which is why it is politically unpalatable and the government hesitates to do so. But, well, the Federal Reserve Bank has to, well, take responsibility and do something. Now, if you chose to increase the demand, not to combat inflation rapidly, but rather to combat the other associated problem, of course, the cost is an increased debt. But whatever problem is of sizable importance, doing nothing, well, usually won't be the solution because people suffer during that time. So hopefully you now understand stagflation, how it is different than the recession. Really, as the model is concerned, it's still us using the same mechanisms, but its application, because of political consideration and how it's going to affect the American population, is very different. Goodbye.